Welcome back. Rhetoric Warriors podcast. Once again, adding some complication to your communication. How about that? More complicated, sophisticated communication.
It's like roughage in the diet, huh?
Something. We're trying to up your game a little bit. It's a lot of free talk on here from people who think a lot about language and what it does out in the world. So I'm Dr. Dan, American rhetorician, stand-up comic, comedy writer, founder of Rhetoric Warriors. I like to get on here and talk to smart people about what's going on in the world and maybe what we can do to improve it. I don't know, deal with it, maybe improve it. Three things on the podcast: talk to comedians. I try to convert humans that have gotten off the pathway of righteous public discourse, and talk to academics and persuasion professionals about rhetoric and public persuasion and private persuasion. What do you do with all these words to get people aligned to what you think the world should look like? Once again, we are back with Dr. David Payne. My main source, my reservoir. I go and fish.
Payne rhetoric, dude, whatever.
we go fish for big rhetoric fish. And we've been talking about the war lately. I wanted to sort of go even farther, more meta about it, and start do an episode on dystopias. Rhetorical dystopia, about how badly everything can go and the stories of how badly it can go, which clearly war is sitting there in the dystopian realm. And so you've done a lot of work on failure and working in the sort of negative space of rhetoric. Just curious where we can get to if we start talking about dystopias, and we'll probably dovetail.
I actually have. I didn't realize this when we hatched this topic, that I had written on dystopias of one sort or another. And
you're at that stage of your career where you don't realize the work you've done.
Well, it wasn't framed that way, but it was functionally. It indeed was that way. And I started reflecting that, historically, in terms of rhetorical studies, certainly historically in terms of dystopias, have a deep, longer tradition in apocalyptics. But the late 60s and early 70s were full of sort of these scientific dystopias as modes of persuasion, right? And then people paid notice. Paul Ehrlich, Eco-Catastrophe, The Population Bomb, Alvin Toffler, Future Shock, Jeremy Rifkin, Entropy, and I did wind up writing about a chapter on those and how they function rhetorically, and other people paid notice, because it does, the dystopian future serves as a kind of moral warning that this is the arc that we're headed toward, right? Prince and Rushing really hopped on that with science fiction dystopias about technology. I mean, and we're rife in those that somehow as a moral warning about technology, the Terminators, on and on and on. So science fiction dystopias were a big genre, as especially in their work, a whole spate of films about imagining dystopian futures as a warning about our technological development.
Yeah, technology and pollution, right? Like concrete dystopias, like it's become kind of a moral, cultural dystopia now. Like one of the things I've seen the difference in the right and the left is the right talks about, we're trying to convince everybody we are in a moral, cultural dystopia. Like it's not, we're headed that way. It's like, oh, they're here and they've got control and we've got to do something to grab it back.
Well, yeah, I mean, it could be right now that we've got both kinds operating a lot. I mean, there is sort of the standard apocalyptics, and there is the sense that we're sort of there, right? That this is not some distant teleological outcome. This is kind of the cloud that we're entering in this phase, but we still the climate change stuff, and I started thinking about a lot of these sci-fi dystopias have sort of made a rebound. They remade Fahrenheit. Right, 514, whatever.
451, right?
Yeah. Michael Moore fouled that up in my head, right? And The Handmaid's Tale was big, right? And everybody's going,
oh yeah,
no, this is not like some. This is like now, right? How things are going, right? So I think all
Yeah,
of that certainly.
Handmaid's Tale is a really interesting example of that. That, again, that's a very older, like, themed, very familiar dystopia of, kind of the past and sort of purging and like the crucible and all that kind of stuff just put into the present or the
Sure,
future.
and it's hard not to think about that with these states passing these anti-abortion laws, and you kind of think about Gilead, and maybe I better be moving to Canada more with a more literal way than I think we were intended to. So anyway, I think that stuff is around and fermenting at the same time as this sort of cultural moral utopia. And I did think about the current war as an example that triggers this, because the way we're talking about it, we're not talking, this is every moment is sort of the push to World War III, right?
The ultimate dystopia.
Well, we can't get Russia involved or we will be in World War III. Somehow we can't engage. So I start thinking, well, we've been in proxy wars since 1950 with Korea, Vietnam, on and on and on. Why weren't they, the harbingers of World War III? Although I think in the Cold War, there was also this sort of cloud of possibility. But anyway, it seems more immediate and more like the frame in which we're interpreting the, and that is the rhetoric of dystopia, right? Is that you put that into that ultimate outcome frame.
Well, it's in the theater, right? It's now in the right location. It's in Europe, and it's white people on white people. So it has all the, echoes of World War II. Like it now has scenic, symmetry to that past dystopia.
Well, I guess that's it. Is that it echoes the Second World War in those kinds of ways that Iraq did not, even though, both sides are supplying. Afghanistan twice, once with the Russians and then with, so it's not like we haven't been, having our military equipment fighting Russian military equipment most of the time since 1950, our Chinese or whatever.
Right, but that's a non-dystopian view of war, right? That's a more therapeutic place to end up in, that we're fighting a proxy war here. It's not going to go beyond this level, that we can handle these kind of things, like you said, like it's our military weapons versus their military weapons. It's just the corporations once again expending their warehouses so they can charge us.
Well, that is kind of the comic view, but once again, I think that's getting tarnished with some of this imminent reality.
Well, and like you said, like the images coming back from the Ukraine and things like that, which are dystopian images. The one about where they completely bombed out that port city, I can't even say the names, right? But they completely bombed it out. That was clearly a dystopian image. Like they showed it beautiful before and then just gray and just destroyed. And that's a strong dystopian World War II
right.
image.
Zelensky's own little video did probably the best job of that, right? Of showing happy, dancing Ukrainians, then all of a sudden, but I remember making a similar film when I was in a senior in high school about, here's lovely nature, and then here's all of this pollution, right? Where it's sort of
right.
You're talking about dissonant strategies, right? And that's clearly there.
Well, and this is the challenge, I think. Like I watched this when I did a lot of work in the alternative health space with the vegans, using basically horror film techniques on big farming to show like cows being killed and things. And they were literally shot like horror films, in the dark, crazy, angles, stuff coming out of the, shadows, sound, shocks, all these different things. But when you see that, like with dystopia, and we're trying to see now where Ukraine needs to establish a strong dystopia that Americans can hold on to. But we immediately seem to start to become wary or weary of dystopias. It can only take so much of it before it starts to lose, its rhetorical potential.
Well, maybe we become inured to the drama of it in some ways, but I wonder if the aggregate effect of it. I've often thought about, the effect on a generation of children with teachers all sort of touting, if we don't toe the line, if we don't fix this, if we, that we were doing this great job of informing and moralizing our children, but how long do how long does it take before you kind of go, well, to hell with that, and what's important to me, to become, in a sense, inured to that kind of rhetorical approach.
Well, I think you
So,
nailed it with the ecological rhetoric of the 70s and 80s, which I grew up around, and you heard so much of it. I remember going to Mammoth Cave after I'd started doing stand up, and it's the biggest cave in the country or the world, and it's in Kentucky. And so the park rangers were taking people around, but they were also doing dystopian ecological rhetoric the whole time. Like, they're blind fish down here and they're all dying because then he's like, do you know what they eat? And I'm like, I don't know, park rangers. So I started heckling him because I got so tired of being, hit with that rhetoric. But it was clearly, part of my growing up, that the ecological environmental rhetoric of dystopia. And now it's, like I said, I think it's shifted. The GOP has just shifted it over to culture and morality. It seems like, and even political dystopia.
well, one way to sort of do denial on it is the the sort of the politicization move. This is just more liberal, and so there's direct sort of subversive attempts to get, buy the biggest truck you can, whatever, and completely ignore it, deny climate change, which is an active interpretive industry, right? And at the same time, what we're talking about on the other hand, right? How do people live with that kind of dissonance? At the same time, it is, once again, it isn't this sort of futurist warning. Every tornado is another example. I grew up in Kansas. We had tornadoes daily in the spring, right? But now each one is bigger, badder, not quite, it's out of place. It's in some places it's supposed to be. And it's another harbinger of the climate change is real in here, right? And you have to look at how bad the winter's been and how hot the summers are. And
right. So we have all this symptomology of a dystopia, an actual dystopia, but maybe because we've heard so much of it for so long and it is still an abstraction. So it's easy for the people to get in and find political hay by denying it or blaming us about just trying to get more money for our research. That, like, today, there's a thing today about rivers of current in the air are about to dislodge an ice shelf bigger than half of America that's been there since whatever.
Right.
And I looked at it, I'm like, okay, I've seen that a lot now. The dislodging ice shelves, and I don't know what it means.
Well, we tend to we tend to manage to distance ourselves from things we can't control. What can you do about an ice shelf breaking off? It's not like, I think of Mark Maron and his End of the World comic strip. Well, we recycled. We took our bags to the store. We did as much as we could in the our attempts in the face of ice shelves breaking off and disappearing glaciers.
Right. So when you actually have to deal with a real dystopia that has symptomology all around you, with like the weather and things, images you're seeing, and all this stuff, people can't experience. Like, we can't stay with it long enough for it to become politically efficacious to counter it. Like, and I think this is one of the problems with climate change, the whole rhetoric, is that we've just pounded it so hard for so long that people don't have a reaction to it anymore.
Right. However, there may become this kind of interpretive or even rhetorical habit of mind, or it may even be a kind of a psychosis of sorts in a maybe a non-clinical sense, that what Berg labeled, this tendency to take things to the end of the line, so that now we're encountering inflation. Oh my God, right? Inflation the worst inflation in 40 years or whatever. That interest rates have climbed at above zero, which was sort of the, that all of a sudden, these monumental shifts and people's behavior changing, right? In terms of last year was peak corporate profits. Yet 51% of Americans believe we are already in a recession, let alone the 80% that believe that we will be one by the end of the year. How are you already in a recession? If the demand for these goods is at an all-time high, that means people have money to, anyway. These interpretive frames are floating around out there, all of which take it to the far wall, take it to the end of the line, which is the habit of reasoning of dystopia, right?
Well, and I think, like as rhetorical resources, I'm sitting here with my deck of cards, my 2 deck of cards. Here's my dissonance cards and my utopian cards, or my dystopian and my utopian cards.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, how do I want to play these out? As I go through political things, you're seeing the left right now play a lot of dystopian cards about if Trump gets reelected, if DeSantis, if, all these things, like they're going to destroy democracy. It's a dystopian destruction of democracy.
Right. And we don't have, really good history on how, how sloppy things have been in the past. And I'm willing to say, and I don't know that things are worse now than they have been. And I think we have divisive times before. I think the early 60s obviously were hugely divisive. I think the Civil War, obviously, and other times. But we don't seem to be able to afford it now. I mean, I'm willing to go that far to say it doesn't seem like we can afford this because the consequences seem so dire. Well, and the whole point of utopian versus dystopian, it occurred to me to talk about, and I suppose maybe most people know this, but the idea of utopia, right, in Latin means nowhere. And so utopias were meant to be these idealistic outcomes, right, that were meant as a mirror to hold ourselves up to and thereby create dissonance and guide us. And then the dystopia was kind of a negative version of that is a moral warning to guide us away from that kind of thing. So what does it mean that a negative nowhere turns into here? So, this is not a feature of dystopia that doesn't exist in the world. It's the temptation is to believe you're already in it. And it seems to me that people are succumbing to that temptation.
Yeah, and we move people around psychologically through these constantly. I listen to the liberal rhetoric, and the Biden's rhetoric is very aspirational, very, we can all be Americans and we can all get along. And, those are all utopian outcomes. They're utopian situations.
Right.
Like I used to, when people would say America's in a melting pot, I'd be like, yeah, it's more like a melting pit. You just dump everything in there and who knows what's going to happen. It's not like it's a beautiful stew, it's just as much of a, landfill as it is a
There's still
pot.
chunks floating around.
Yeah. And, that sense of, is this like, we're taking the exact same situations and the right is going, oh, that's a dystopia. We need to go back to the utopia of the past. And the left is like, oh, we're moving towards a utopia if we can just keep going and getting the conservatives and GOP people out of the way and let us clean this stuff up. So it is everybody's got to have both. They've got to have their utopian version, their dystopian version, and then their dystopian version of the utopian version. And those four just keep moving back and forth.
There is the fall from an idealized mythic past, right? Yeah. And that is the conservative responses to you must do reset somehow, which is the only way to really read a party right now that has absolutely no platform. That isn't to say there is no agenda. Obviously there is.
Right. They have sheer technique.
Maybe it says if we actually told you what we plan to do, nobody would vote for us.
Right, but they've picked up the politics of dissonance, the politics of stain, the politics of dystopia, that if they can just attack and shit on everything that is in opposition to them, they get political traction. And it's just over and over working that field over and over again to turn it darker and darker and darker.
Well, does seem to be what's going on. Yet at the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, right, I think that is kind of at least one of the chief disenchantments of the progressive movement against Biden is, well, he's just not, we need idealism. We need somebody to turn us on and, the glint in the eye, the aspiration. And of course, when at my age, it's kind of, I just want, sane and normal, please. I'm tired of losing elections.
Right. Well, and I think that, the progressive versus the centrist, on the left is a really interesting rhetorical area for sure. Like there's not enough of utopia here. Like you're allowing all these dystopian elements to continue along like they're neutrals, but look at the profit center, look at the anti-union, and again,
Yeah,
the
no, I don't have a
progressives.
speech to utopian and dystopia. Maybe you can figure it out. But here's Biden with a, I don't know, let's say 42% approval rating, which is always reported as completely disastrous. Trump never got higher than that, and that was absolutely a victory. Furthermore, if you start asking the 58% who disapprove for what reason they disapprove, I'm pretty sure you're going to find some of those, a huge chunk of those are the progressive idealists. In other words, they don't really agree on what's wrong here or why it's dissatisfied. But yet we continue to pose this as a binary that spells nothing but disaster, and threatens that other party that gets 42% is absolutely going to win. And that's another dystopian motivator, right? One I'm deeply invested in, actually.
Right. Well, and I think if there is something that Trump does really well, it is dystopias. Like he just creates dystopia energy about everything. Like he literally, it's right now Trump versus truth, right? It's literally Trumpism and propaganda versus the concept of truth. Like I'm just going to say time and time again that the election was stolen and I don't care about truth. I'm going to make that a dystopia, whether you want to let me do that or not. And it's interesting to watch him just, it's this kind of military onslaught, just keep shelling the people with these dystopian claims. Truth makes no difference whatsoever.
Well, and it could be kind of the oxymoron, perhaps, of having run on a previous dystopia. Oh, things are awful. We got crime in the streets. We got blah, 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 blah. And I'm going to make, America better again. And then after 4 years, how can you can say I'm going to make, you can start saying, well, we're going to keep it better, but we didn't do anything. So we're still going to make it, or make it better again. So people are not living in the material reality that corresponds to these words. So I think maybe the stolen election is kind of the substitution. That is prima facie evidence of the dystopia that we are in an election. You can't, it's been taken over by the bad guys, and that this is a rescue operation.
Yeah, evidence becomes an interesting concept within dystopias like this, right?
Or I'm missing one. I don't know.
But they have to create some type of evidence. Like the interesting thing I always thought about Hillary and the emails was that it was such a sinister kind of spyish, conspiratorial power behind the power phrase.
Right.
She where the emails go. Like you literally did a tech magic trick here to hide, and it doesn't matter what it is at that point. So it's a perfect stain because you can't disprove it. She's not going to release them at that point. Has all these hues of dystopia around it, literally technological dystopia and spy dystopia. And they've been looking for another one just as cleanly, lance in the heart as that.
Well, and Hunter Biden is kind of that.
Yeah, a laptop.
There's more emails, and they say stuff. No, I sort of knew we were in trouble when a guy stopped me at the gym to talk with me, and that was his about the election, and that was his thing, is that there's a lot in these emails that's going to come out. There's a lot in these emails that's going to come out, which, as far as I can tell, there really wasn't hardly anything at all new there.
Right.
But the having created that vacuum for it, one can sort of imagine whatever else.
Hey, hold on just a second, Dave. I'm going to hit
Sure.
pause. All right, we're back. Sorry, quick brief interruption there for stuff going on behind me. Yeah.
So yeah, we were talking about evidence, right? And that.
Yeah.
What makes it evident to you, and somehow that evidence is cropping up. Gas prices.
Well, and evidence.
Tornadoes, right? Everything's a sign.
So sort of fictive dystopias right?
Right.
They have the evidence of conspiracy level evidence. So it looks like it might be weird, or like I saw somebody post the other day that somebody walked up to them randomly at the airport, and they have a couple little kids, and they were telling the kids they're pedophiles. They kidnapped you. Just pay attention because I'm telling you right now. And so that whole pedophilia dystopia, to make that fictive world real enough that people are holding on to it and using it as a template to look at the world, it's pretty impressive rhetoric.
Well, and talk about turning that into evidence. Yeah, the Supreme Court. I mean, that was quite a chain of associations to go from what was by all analyses, a very normal judicial record on making these sentences to evidence of, right, and that just fed right into. So once again, the utopia provides the mythic context in which these things become signs, and therefore the evidence that right of the moral dangers. So it is a psychosis. These things mean things well beyond, right, in a context of some sort of woven interpretive reality, where things all have their supercharged meanings. Yeah. Anyway, the pedophilia thing is fascinating and scary.
It is, but it's that sense of the supernatural within your dystopia, right? And I think that's a strong element in all this stuff, that we're so used to superhero stories and supernaturalism and religion and mysticism, that putting it into a real life story isn't that weird for people anymore. They're like, yeah, maybe they're blood drinking pedophiles. I don't know.
Well, how can you say that they're not?
Prove it to me. Yeah, prove to me that dystopia is not real.
It's possible. What do I know? Right.
When I see that stuff start to echo out into people's operant belief systems, their day-to-day interaction with other human beings systems, and you're like, wow, I think that's where so many people get just amazed by fictive rhetoric, this kind of narrative rhetoric of dystopian collusive stories and things like that. It's sticking, like it's actually sticking in people's minds, and they're now operating with it out in the world.
Right.
And I'm like, well, that's what rhetoric is supposed to do. It's supposed to maybe start as language, move into your head, and then become behavior. Like that is the flow.
Right. Well, I think we have to get at, what is a belief system, and the sort of the rational traditional concept is that people try to maintain some sort of integrity and coherence among their beliefs, but I'm not sure psychologically that's necessarily the case, and since we have these different sorts of plausibility universes and media inputs, or fictional universes, if you want to call them that, it's troubling to me that the idea of the metaverse, right? This idea that we're going to feed our children on a new metaverse where everybody's in alligator avatars or whatever's going on there. I don't know. Let's add one more. That these things do bleed into each other, and I think that's where the concept of psychoses is relevant. And that we can have disassociations that most people probably do maintain a number of plausibility structures.
Gonna make it? You all right?
I need water.
Some water? Yeah, go ahead. I'll hit pause. All right, we're getting bumped.
So I think one thing that the internet does, and our way of participating, say chat rooms or other kinds of contact systems, so like QAnon or whatever that is, some sort of web behavior, web sociology does allow one to, and I would think if you were to really find most of these people, the number of people who absolutely believe it fervently and are willing to make that their mainframe operating reality are probably very few. Most people, I think, probably engage it as a kind of a plausibility form of entertainment. where nothing is really at stake. Yet nonetheless, that becomes a framework that they can then refer back to, make associations back to out of other, like, political reality. So that the pedophilia, this is just, once again, more evidence of our profound associative abilities. How abstract the basic human can function. The child porn, and certainly it had some agents there like Ted Cruz making this seem like a very real thing. And that, once again, sort of feeds back into that plausibility structure of some sort or another. So people are probably walking around with a number of indeterminate, plausible, or potential, or even mythic or cartoon-like systems, but they don't believe them with equal intensity. And usually it's not until those are, by some sort of agent, put into dissonance with each other that one has to choose, right?
Right. Well, they're
And
never.
that's what political rhetoric does.
In a way, I guess that's true, but they never really do have to choose. It seems like everybody's self-selecting now, and just if they're running into somebody that wants to puncture the dystopia, they just avoid them. There was a nice little interview this week of there's a whole crew now of freelancers and Comedy Central who send people to the Trump rallies to do interviews and just, present a little bit of logic or something and catch these people into saying the craziest shit that they've got. And one of the things this week was like, well, so if Trump is still in charge and has been running the whole thing the whole time, or no, the one this week was Antifa. They're like, yeah, Antifa was responsible for January 6th. Like, well, why would they interrupt their own win? Like, they won that election. And the guy just froze, and they just stayed on him for like 30 seconds, and he literally could not talk anymore.
Interesting. It's like, there's about 10 old Star Trek episodes where Kirk outsmarts a computer by by using logical contradiction.
Yeah.
And the computer just fritzes and
right. It just starts to smoke. Yeah. But people, when you hold them to their feet to the logical fire, sure, but they don't do that themselves. They just skim right past it and stay in the narrative. Sure. Right.
And maybe the point, or a point, is that politics simply becomes another one of these. I mean, politics has always attracted extreme fringe types, right? And the people who live in what James called a double-storied mystery, right? They have unintegrated lives, the true believers, right? And so, and that is kind of the, so voting and the voting season for most people is highly specialized and mostly, unpenetrating set of choices that they make close to the election. Most people are not watching either MSNBC, or I guess a lot of people are watching Fox, but that's still not, right? That still is a kind of an entertainment frame that's reinforcing these extraordinary, but they don't act on them. They're not conducting life on these. So I guess the politician has to somehow activate that and make it seem real, only for the purpose of choosing, at the time of the vote.
Right.
Which seems to be all of the season. But most people, by and large, are not want really, and that becomes more and more evident. So I become always suspicious of 70% of Republicans think, but there's only 27% of the people who say they're Republicans, right?
Right.
So what does that statistic mean?
So that's
exactly.
Like 12% of the population says.
I know.
Yeah.
And there's always been like 20% of the population who will believe almost anything. There's nothing new about that. So once again, the dramatism of media tends to exacerbate those extremes, and those are kind of more like video game worlds than they are, right, reality information systems.
Well, and then we go back to the war, right, which is clearly a lived dystopia for people in Ukraine right now, and people are dying and things are being destroyed. but we're experiencing it still as a fictive dystopia.
Right.
It is not real to us.
Well, everybody got so mad at Baudrillard when he said that Vietnam was not a real war. And they were just so upset with him about this, right? Real people died. Well, that isn't really what he was saying. He was talking about how do you experience this and how does it mean for you?
Right.
And but I think that's right. And I think once again, it is this kind of I'm having to live in a world where this can happen.
Well, and the difference between a cartoonish, as you were saying, dystopia and a documentarian dystopia, which is what they're trying to do with Ukraine, is to document it enough to the point where it has a reality through the media for people that will never go there and probably never meet a Ukrainian. And that documentarian feel that they have for the footage. And you're like Sean Penn coming out and saying, I had to walk on foot to get out of the Ukraine because I was shooting my documentary there. And now I'm thinking about arming and going back and fighting Russia myself. Well, that's just a really fascinating juncture of Hollywood. They've never known what to do with Sean Penn because he actually goes to the dystopian location.
Right.
Like when the Republicans, when the GOP, the senators went down to the border, which they want to make a dystopian location. And they did this fictive visit of putting on a, vest and standing there at night with a light. Everybody's like, no, that's bad fictive dystopia. We're not buying it. But now you're getting over here the Ukraine, which is a real thing. And like, it's not being documented in the way people want somehow. It's not being made real enough or coherent enough in a narrative that people can hold on to. We're getting fragments of dystopia.
What's that?
We're getting fragments of dystopia.
Right, but we are kind of putting it together into one bundle. I think that this is Holocaust, it's genocide. All of the terms are coming out. Right?
Well, the chemical weapons last week, they're trying to yank it over into our formed up dystopian narratives for war.
Right.
Like which one will hit the bell strongly enough for Americans to go, you know what? Maybe we'll take a shot at this World War III thing.
I think more and more you're getting people that are willing to say, yeah, why are we stopping at this line? I don't know whether they've even tried to do polling. And so there does seem to be this kind of sober reality to it. And in terms of simply persuasion and legitimacy, each time we kind of jump to that edge, then the drip of news is, well, and Biden approved another 800 million, and that seems okay, right? This gets us through the news cycle.
At least we're firing money at Putin. We're firing, we're doing economic warfare.
Pretty much. I keep thinking about it, and yet talking about dissonant worlds. Yet here we are with inflation and in a recession, not. And each javelin missile cost $80,000. Every one that we fire could take an American family and put them in the upper 2% of income.
It's crazy, yeah.
But we don't dare spend any of that kind of money.
Well, have you seen the meme about war is, guys who don't make $2 a week shooting weapons that they will never earn as much in the entire life at a airplane or a tank that costs more than their entire village will ever make. And that's
these tanks are worth about $4 million, something like that.
Yeah.
It's truly an amazing thing and I guess that's the goal of the rhetoric, is turn the calculator off. Compared to really being in the war. But
well, that's what we did with Vietnam, right? They turned the calculator back on. It's like, hey, this is just a corporate exercise. Look at this, and then the Halliburton in Desert Storm, like that's one of our evils, one of our villains that will allow back into the dystopian narrative. Hey, this is all just corporations spending, their wares so they can repopulate the profits.
No. This is the government giving money to corporations.
Well, yeah, but then they do the turn of, well, the government is just a shill of the corporations anyway. So, but that dystopian behind the scenesness of like, who are the villains? Can we make them clear? Is there enough clarity that we can establish them as villains in this world so that people will then act in these ways? And you see it, it's just this big conglomeration of these two sides trying to force villains up into the spotlight. Like Putin isn't, everybody knows the word Putin, but how often is he actually, I mean, how much interaction have we had with that guy the last 25 years? I don't know much about him.
It's true. It's true. And I heard a little snippet that he had enjoyed like a 40% popularity, right? Higher than most of our own domestic politicians until this debacle, right?
Yeah. And the KGB, they pull those three letters out and they throw those on him, and you're like, well, he must be bad. Like the KGB thing, he came from spy world,
right? Which means he's capable of all these dark genius-like moves, but as it, I guess, turns out, he wasn't really that big of a deal in the KGB. He was kind of more a bureaucrat or whatever. I certainly don't know. I think both narratives are out there.
Well, take it out of the war and like go dystopian, like the dystopian stories of self. Like I see these a lot, and you probably speak to this, but I see a lot of it having come from Austin and now being in LA. The dystopia, the internal dystopia that you are. I watched the movie Her last night with Joaquin.
Right.
Joaquin
I have
Phoenix.
not seen that one, but yeah.
It's kind of slow, but it was written by a guy, who did Being John Malkovich, and very internal and neurotic. And so you're basically exposed to this guy's neurosis for 2 hours. And he ends up with, I'm a horrible person, and but then he gets an epiphany, which is kind of weak. But it's the dystopia of the self. I'm so neurotic. I'm bad for everybody who comes into contact with me, and ergo I can't have a good relationship. But I see a lot of that in Austin, like everybody working on their internal dystopia.
Well, I guess that's one way you can think about it. I think our psychologistic therapeutic rhetoric does basically the same design on how one thinks about themselves, their origins and their trajectory. And the basic rhetoric of conversion, right? Of you're living this
It's
life of
dystopia
sin,
to utopia, right?
and if you died tonight, what would happen to you? Well, going to the big utopia, right? It once again, it does moral discourse in the same kind of ultimate terms, that you evaluate each little thing. So yeah, I mean, listening to rock and roll music or smoking cigarettes or drinking or whatever happens to be your sin, each individual act doesn't seem so bad, but it all adds up to right.
Internal dystopia. You are
yeah.
going, and then you're going to the ultimate dystopia, which is hell. Right. That
right.
You think,
well, that's how
think
you
this is
right?
bad. Yeah. Guess what? There's a really bad dystopia that.
So all of those become warrants for transformation, right? Those all become warrants. So these are the things that tell you what to change, that guide you to this synergistic, more positive outcome. So yeah, the rhetoric of conversion and therapy has been full of that kind of existential, malaise. And who doesn't feel that, right? So
well, this is why I've always really liked rhetoric, because rhetoric to me just lifts it back up always into the technology, the linguistic technology. Like, sure. I don't care. Like, yeah, I can feel lonely or, depressed or malaise, all the disenfranchisement, all that kind of stuff. But they're really just the outcomes of me believing I'm in a dystopia, right? That there was a good tweet the other day. Somebody's like, why is life so expensive and I'm not even having any fun? It's like, yeah, why is it a dystopia? Why am I in this dystopia? And then it's probably my fault. Like I'm in there because of my bad internal dystopia.
Sure. It's back to the control thing. That's the only thing you can control. So ultimately one way or another, no matter where the fault begins in the world, it winds up in your lap, because all you can control is you and your actions, right?
Well, I know this from working with businesses, that you've got to get people into pain, into dissonance, into dystopian feelings before you can get them to do anything really. So well, right. I have to go in and disparage their current communications. Like, oh, you're losing customers because people run into this brand. They're like, what is this? It's terrible. And you never even get to sell to them. And if I can get them into that state, and like, oh yeah, I can come in and fix that for you because I understand utopia and how to build a utopia.
Right, or you know, I mean, all ideological persuasion operates in the same fashion, right? It's that, how do you explain someone's misery and pain to them, right? Ultimately, you can say, well, it's because of this out there. It's because of, you know, liberals. It's because of immorality. It's because of whatever. So, you know, I mean, so in that sense, the current conservative, you know, ideology doesn't operate any different than the Marxist ideology. It explains to you in grand terms in ways that give you a choice and empower you to do something about it in an individual, right? It is yourself that's going to get on board of this, and whether or not the real outcomes occur in the world, you purify yourself, right?
Yeah, the rhetorical strategies are the same. They're just changing out content.
Right.
I've got to get people to feel a certain type of dissonance because I have to attach that to a dystopia that has causes. Like, here are the causes of that dystopia, and then I have to promise I can change that.
Well, once again, we talked about how living in this psychotic, overly interpreted, collaborated or confabulated world, gas prices become a looming sign of the end, or right, tornadoes become a sign of the climate change debacle. Whatever, or snowed again. Oh my God, that it's true. The same thing is then your feelings become evidence, right? Your misery, your anxiety, your whatever is bothering you, right? That's why Tom Wolfe in The Me Decade opens up with the scene of the woman in the S meeting, where he's told her to focus on that one thing that's bothering you, and she stands up and screams, "My hemorrhoids." That's the one thing that's keeping her business world, her confidence at meetings, from being perfect, right? So it's a brilliant essay, right? And this is 1974.
Sure.
So at any rate, it is that thing that is somehow, that flaw in the world that is somehow internalized into your interior way of going through the world, and it is that, you know, speaking the language within of this rhetoric. So, right, it is the inside and the outside. They're working together.
Well, and it's such an odd space to try to stay with your good rhetorical critic theorist distance, where like you're feeling these things that are being forced in, even because you're a human being, even though you know it's being constructed rhetorically, and you're like, okay, how do I see this for other people that don't even have the rhetorical apparatus to separate from those feelings a little bit and see what's going on? Like when I talk to people and they're just so, you know, stuck in the dissonance of what's been dumped into them from both sides. You know, my daughter getting really, really upset about trans rights and why it's so unfair. And I just watch her just clench up and just all the emotions there. And I'm like, hey, let's step back and look at it from a meta perspective, so you don't get completely locked up into this emotional, you know, broccoli head that you're just crunched and you can't do anything in it. And I think that's one of the things I use rhetoric as, is like, hey, it's not about right or wrong, or what, it's about getting some rhetorical distance, some meta space, so that you can be functional. Because otherwise you're just being pushed around by all this ocean of dissonance.
I think that's right. Finding a way at least to bracket some of that stuff off, and to and you know, ideally maybe focus your own efforts, right? You only got so many disaster cards to spend here. Which one is going to be the thing that you work against, right?
Well, and everybody getting upset because of the slap, you know, Will Smith's slap of Chris Rock taking media precedence over Ukraine.
Right.
I'm like, do you realize, like, I'm going to do a show at some point on that slap. There's so much that happened in that moment. We'll have to come back around to it next time, maybe, because it was so perfectly real in a completely fictive environment. And it just brought all these things together in this single moment. And plus, I'm good friends with Chris Rock's main writer, so I can actually get some insight.
Well, he said he was working on it. That when he talks about it, it will be funny. So maybe you have an insight into how he
Yeah.
will
Yeah,
eventually turn this to something else.
yeah, we'll see. But I mean, the dissonance of, the dystopia of that, like, and it was funny for comedians. The immediate dystopia for comedians was, hey, you realize how bad it is in clubs right now, because you can't say anything without some trumper or somebody just jumping up and yelling at you and heckling. Now
Right.
you've empowered them to also physically attack you.
Well, that was Colbert's first line is, let me start by saying it's never right to hit a comedian.
Ah, you know, I've seen it happen multiple times over the years where an audience member will attack a comedian, in a club. I've seen Mark Maron actually get tackled on stage
Really?
one night. Yeah, he
Wow.
was having a horrible set at the Largo here in LA, and he wasn't on and he didn't care, and the audience didn't like him. He got to the end, he was so like, yeah, because I'm going to do my bit about suicide and then I'm going to get out of here. And the guy in the front row was like, no, you're not. And Maron's like, how dare you censor me? Like, I'm going to do it. And the guy's like, no, my brother killed himself 2 months ago. I don't want to hear this. And Maron's
Wow.
like, well, sorry, I'm going to do it. And the guy just tackled him on stage.
Yeah.
End of the show. Like, and I was walking out afterwards.
However, it was kind of the only way to rescue that night for him.
And I told him, I was walking by and he was talking to Janine Garofalo, and I'm like, hey, Maron, best closer in the business, man. Said you killed it. And he was pretty whacked out at that point. But it's this sense of when comedy can be like when you can physically respond, that's dystopia for comedians.
Well, I mean, and people kind of became suspicious that this was staged because it's the only thing one cared about or remembered about the Oscars this year, right? So.
Yeah, it could have been staged, but no, it wasn't even close to being staged. Like, I have people still ask me like 2 weeks later, like, was that staged? And I'm like, no, that wasn't staged.
Well, yeah, I mean, the way Chris Rock just sort of let it happen was one wonders. One wonders.
The last thing you expect is reality in the middle of your fiction.
It was
the fiction.
Right. Well, I Victor Turner, the sociologist, and talked about in the social drama that there is this rupture, right, and that was the rupture, that was the breach, and that's in the that all of a sudden then we've got to start, and that is another kind of dystopian social psychology there. Oh, something terrible happened that is out of the normal, and it must be explained. It must be repaired somehow. You've got to rearrange everything to put it into place, and that's similar to how we're reading all of these other events, the war and the climate catastrophes, and on and on and on.
Well, and we'll talk about this in a future episode. What I've been calling the multiplicity. Like, it's not a synchronicity, it's a multiplicity. Right. And the metaverse is a version of it, because you run out of story resources in superhero world if you're only in one world. If you can suddenly break the universe and add in other universes with other rules, then it's not as, I think we're gonna have a hard time story-wise holding on to that for very long. It just gets too much. Right. But right now it's dystopias fighting other dystopias for the attention of the population. It's a war between dystopias. Sure.
There's only so much mind space for her.
I can only take so much dystopia. Which one you got for me?
Well, oddly enough, I thought about all of this watching the new Spider-Man the other night, which sort of features the multiverse and the ability to extend the story by bringing back the previous Spider-Man and the villains into one. And of course, the spate of superhero narratives they're all dystopian, right? They're all ultimate. I mean, the nice thing about the comics when I was a kid is, Superman caught some bank robbers or something, right? I mean, occasionally he'd do something earth-shaking, but it was kind of out there. It wasn't
not enough. Stakes aren't high enough. We
didn't destroy New York for 25 minutes at the end of we didn't reenact 9/11 in grand terms every time. And so anyway, so that whole language has sort of been assimilated, and I was sort of toying with my fellow watchers saying, well, if you can bring back all these other Spider-Men because they were in other movies, why can't you bring John Wayne into this movie? Why can't you, they were in a movie once. Why can't Clark Gable show up? why are there any new rules here, right?
There's not.
Why are we only bringing back these guys? You know?
Well, and I think that our training, we look at our narrative and our fictive training that we get from the media and from our books and things about our Bibles, about dystopias, and clearly dystopia and rhetoric is a really strong architecture within rhetoric. And you watch it play out in the election coming up. Essentially, I think, Biden, he said this fairly recently. We're like, do you want to run against Trump again? He's like, yes, please. Because for the left, Trump is walking dystopia. It never goes away. It always gets worse. He is every
the
time.
sign. Yeah, he is the sign. And that's unfortunate, because I think there probably are more dangerous people around. It's frightening as it is to say that, and I worry about them. But I've heard political commentators recently say the same thing, that the only thing that will rescue the Dems is to put Trump on the ballot. That is, you're voting to keep Trump and Trumpism at bay here. That's the only thing that elected Biden and unified people. So you're right. There are these there's a multiverse here and a multiplicity, and we're more and more, like countries that have to forge coalitions. I mean, there's 40 political parties. You've got to get 3 of them big enough, even though you may not agree on stuff. And we don't function. Rhetorically, mythically, we don't function that way. But we're having to forge that somehow.
Well, it almost sounds
I think we're all
better.
kind of at that stage, right?
Right. I mean, a balkanized state almost sounds better than a coherent red, half of the country.
Right.
Like keep them in, like, this is what everybody always was about, like Iran and Iraq. It's like, as long as they're fighting each other, they don't turn against us. So that was the whole policy in the Middle East. It seemed like was, well, keep them where they don't have nuclear weapons, just let them fight forever, and they will never band together to come at the West.
Right. Well, and this is kind of the weak spot in, the Biden coalition, as it was referred to mostly by the Republicans, like the Lincoln Project guys. But no, I mean, I've heard, the African Americans, he hasn't delivered the things that they wanted, so they're not enchanted. The progressives didn't get the things they wanted, and so they're not enchanted. Well, and the only thing that will get their attention to say, well, if you keep thinking that way, you're going to reelect Trump.
Right, you'll get your dystopia. You'll get a much worse dystopia. Like, I think the politics of, hey, Biden's not a dystopia. They keep trying to dystopia him. The progressives do, but they're basically saying you haven't delivered on a utopian vision. And I don't think he ever gave a particularly new utopian vision other than just straight democracy. Like, he was just utopian democracy about, we don't do this, we don't this, we just need to vote.
Let's resurrect the old division of civil society and politics that work, and and there is going to come a point, and maybe we're there, that just seems naive and quaint, as generationally we move on.
Well, it's a bland narrative, though, to go back to just the civil democracy. I don't think is enough of utopia for a lot of.
But Biden can still be emblematic of the dystopia from the other side, the Trumpian dystopia, the MAGA, or the hard right dystopia. He's another sign of all this liberalism, all this wokeism. I mean, my God, nominating that black woman to the Supreme Court.
They can dystopia anybody. All you need is, like, look at his his body language. He completely believes the Green New Deal. Again, that's why I said, like, evidence becomes useless really in that world, because it just needs an iota or even just a hint or a waft of what it is then they just fan it and blow it up. So evidence really doesn't work in the same way for that type of rhetoric.
And once again, that is classic religious kind of reasoning, right? I reminded the story of a Skid Row preacher, right, who was preaching hellfire and damnation, and some old drunk says, "Oh, this is really boring. And the minister says, see there, the devil is here among us, right?
Hecklers are the devil.
Anything that distracts can automatically be folded into the narrative, right?
Yeah, well, and that's the power.
And
of
I think once again, if you
narratives.
lived in that supercharged psychotic universe, that becomes the way it is. Anything becomes a sign.
Yeah,
that you're living in this monarchy and a split world.
Again, this is why I find dystopias really fascinating. I think utopias, maybe we'll talk about that at some point in the future too. Like, how do you construct a really compelling utopia? Because clearly that's what the left runs more on utopias, this utopian vision of democracy and everybody getting along and things like
progress,
that.
right? It's something to move toward, right? Although once again, the idealized past has its similarities, I suppose, but
in a way, but they don't really talk about the past. They hit it a little bit, but they don't.
And I think that's right. Is that amid this sort, and I think this is a great segue to our wrapping up moment of thinking about the rhetoric of the next election in just sort of these competing dystopian realities. That where is this positive, forward-looking vision that people can buy into? It's pretty thin.
Is it even strong enough to get people to vote? Is it psychologically activating? Most of our
I think
narratives,
rhetorically it kind of has to be there,
I would hope,
but
really,
I don't know that people actually depend on it.
But it's more the psychological activation is more escaping the dystopia, right? That's the real victory.
I think so. We'll see whether anybody can forge a meaningful and compelling. But I think that is kind of the question. But once again, progressivism depends on that kind of. But that vision is itself the nightmare of the right, and
well, we'll circle back around. We'll do rhetoric of utopia here soon, because I think if you look at progressives and what they need to actually create rhetorically in the world, a vibrant utopia that isn't just, hey, I'm going to give you free childcare, and things like that. It needs to have that type of texture and heft if it's going to function, because it's functioning against, like we were saying, a multiplicity of really heightened, highly charged dystopias. Like, the sophistication of the dystopian rhetoric is really high right now. They're doing it really well. And if utopia is going to compete, it's got to have the same, texture and depth. Seems to me. Well, you get out there.
I would love to be able to disagree.
You get out there and do your. David's been building a retaining wall against the right. It's just a big political retaining wall.
Well, I was actually against erosion, but it's we can see it as a metaphor.
I think we can completely.
Or we can say, why bother, right? Florida is going to be underwater soon. Why bother?
That's true. Well, you built your intellectual retaining wall for years in universities, right? For the students.
There you go. The ivory tower above the fray. Even though the river may be up.
Well, thanks for popping on again. Always fun. We will circle back around, and we'll talk to Dave Payne again. Get out there, persuade some people, break dystopias, build dystopias, do whatever you need in order to get things oriented to us all living in a decent place. And we will circle back around.
Find your own personal utopia.
Yeah, your own personal utopia. You're my own private Idaho utopia. All right, we'll see you.